Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Amherstburg Freedom Museum's Black History Series presentation, Black Women in the Fight for Freedom, Reconsidering Underground Railroad Geographies and Timelines in North America. Today's guest speaker is Dr. María Esther Hammack, who some of you may recall was our very first guest speaker back in May 2020 when we started this series. So we're so grateful to have her back again. Dr. Hammack is the Barra Postdoctoral Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. She is a Mexican scholar and public historian whose work centers and connects through a gender lens the history of liberation and abolition in North America and the Black diaspora in Mexico. She is currently teaching at the University of Pennsylvania and revising her first book, Channels of Liberation, Freedom Fighters South of U.S. Slavery. So during Dr. Hammack's presentation, we ask that everyone please mute their microphones and turn off your camera while she's presenting. Following her presentation, there will be a Q&A, and you can turn on your cameras then. But just type in any questions you have in the comments section or raise your hand and I'll call on you. And I'll also be sharing a list of suggested resources on our Facebook page, Amherstburg Freedom, which have been provided by Dr. Hammack so that you can learn more. I hope that you enjoy today's presentation. And let's get started. I'm so excited to hear this presentation. So I will pass it over to you, Dr. Hammack. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laureen, and thank you so much to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for opening up this space, not only for me to come and speak today about this project, but to really share some of my work in your space, in the brick and mortar exhibit that we're going to be putting up this coming up month. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. And I hope that you enjoy. So what I wanted to do first is talk a little bit about the exhibit and what I envision for it. I'm going to talk a little bit about language, some of the driving things that I have for this exhibit, and also sort of showcase some of the documents and the actors that I would be highlighting in this exhibit. And originally we had conceived to do this exhibit in brick and mortar, but the pandemic really rained on a lot of the actual plans. But so what we're planning now is having a brick and mortar exhibit at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, as well as the side-by-side virtual exhibit that people can access from wherever they are. So like a briefer version of the brick and mortar exhibit. And so our plan is to open it and for Women's History Month next month. So look for more information mid-month on the Amherstburg Freedom Museum site. And so what I wanted to start through first is, for instance, I wanted to talk about how I conceptualize this exhibit. I really do hope to tell the stories of women and women who were leading this fight for freedom in North America. Some of the things that I'm going to point out really refer to how I situate individuals, the language that I use. So that it has been very important to the work that I do, but also to how I conceptualize public spaces and museum spaces, or the information that patrons can receive or the public can receive to better understand these histories. So one of the things that I do in my work is focus on language in the sense that I reconsider how people are discussed about or talked about, and specifically in conversations of situating people who escaped bondage, who fled. I don't situate them as runaways or as fugitives from bondage, because I consider that language is part of the language of the institution of slavery. And so I, based on the work, or I build on the work of Dr. Cheryl LaRoche, who really places emphasis on that language, I reconsider, instead of situating them as fugitives or runaways, I reconsider individuals as freedom fighters. So people that were pushing this fight for freedom, this fight for liberation throughout not only the 19th century, but the 18th century as well. I also talk about in this, I'm going to talk about in this presentation, but also in the exhibit, contextualize the idea of freedom and liberation, in the sense that freedom and liberation for people that left US spaces to claim freedom in Mexican and Canadian spaces, that freedom was very fragile. And I build on the work of scholars such as Erica Dunbar that considers how Black women engineered freedom or access freedom or claim freedom in spaces like Philadelphia, but that freedom was in many ways fragile in many different levels. And so that is something that I also want to contextualize and highlight in this exhibit. The next thing that I would like to highlight and broaden really is this idea this idea or metaphor of the Underground Railroad. I do intend through my work, but also through this exhibit that we're working on, is to expand or broaden the geographies and the timelines of liberation in North America. And so with the stories that we're going to be highlighting, we hope that it allows us to better understand this notion of the Underground Railroad, considering that the Underground Railroad as a term or terminology really did not begin to or start to be utilized before 1839. So that did not exist. That notion did not exist of the Underground Railroad before 1839. And so one of the things that I try to do is to expand that timeline and say, really, people were leading through these channels and reaching freedom both north and south of US slavery as early as the mid-1700s, and so, or the 18th century. And so I hope that this exhibit also highlights that. And also, one of the things that we will highlight as well, or try to highlight, is this process of the process of abolition that happened simultaneously in Canadian destinations and in Mexican destinations through this period, particularly emphasizing some of the legal abolition laws and decrees that often was, often was very slow to happen, but nevertheless were processes in motion throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And so, again, before we proceed, this exhibit is not going to be a comprehensive history, but it is hopefully it will help raise questions about why we don't learn about this history simultaneously. It will raise questions about how to reconsider North American freedom in tandem, as well as hopefully open up for more research and more collaborations to happen. And so the stories that I wanted to start with that I hope to highlight in this exhibit are the stories, for instance, to introduce this exhibit, the stories of two women who truly were, I consider them catalysts for engineering liberation in North America, north and south of US slavery. We all know about Chloe Cooley, or many of us know about Chloe Cooley, who was a Black woman enslaved in Upper Canada, and how she fought against bondage. We know about her fight against being sold across the Niagara River to US enslavers on March 14th of 1793. And most of us know that her fight was a fierce one. She was a woman who resisted with everything she had. She screamed, she fought with her bare hands. She made sure her voice was heard. She was screaming for assistance, for help. She was fighting that hard. In her fight, while it was that strong and powerful, it was simultaneously silenced as well. But her fight was not in vain. Even with her being re-enslaved and not actually securing her freedom, she actually her fight led to tangible legislation to be passed, producing the act to prevent the further introduction of slaves and to limit the term of contract for servitude in Upper Canada, which actually passed on July 9th of 1793. And so that is very important to me because I start seeing these trends where it were Black women who were fighting to be free that begin to shape the processes of abolition in North America. And if you want to learn more about Chloe Cooley, the brilliant Natasha Henry has written about her for the Canadian Encyclopedia. So I also, Laureen will share the link to her biography and her information if you're interested in learning more about her. But there's also the Chloe story really offered this idea of reconsidering who else was doing this work, who else was doing this fighting for freedom. And I don't know if many of you originally were in the presentation that I gave when I was in Canada at the Shungsuk Museum. One of the things that I started me doing this work is because I really wanted to find, who were the Harriet Tubmans who led people to Mexico, right? And so this has been a long journey, but so when I consider Chloe Cooley, I understand and think that it is very important that we situate her story with stories of women such as Teresa, which I will tell you about now. Teresa truly set a precedent as well, like Chloe, that applied to North America in the late 1780s, and actually a few years before Chloe. Teresa was a Black woman enslaved by British enslavers in the Caribbean. In the spring of 1784, Teresa took her children from her British enslavers to escape. She got on a boat because she was in one of the islands in the Caribbean held by British enslavers, and she made it to Trinidad de Barlovento, which was a island under Spanish rule. She arrived there safely and ready to fight for her and her children's freedom. Teresa immediately navigated that geography and that space and the governing agencies, and she was able to send a petition directly to the King of Spain himself. And in that petition, she claimed that, and these are her words, that her English enslaver inflicted terrible violence upon her, and therefore she hoped to claim freedom in that space. And her fight, just like Chloe Cooley's, led to the issuing of the Royal Cedula of 1789. And the Royal Cedula was issued on April 14th of 1789. And this cedula, this decree, royal decree, instructed, and I'm quoting from the decree that you see on the screen, any enslaved person, well, what you see on the screen is in Spanish, but I'm quoting and translating. So any enslaved person to arrive fugitive from his or her foreign master must not be returned to those masters. And this legislation allowed also enslaved people to claim freedom by order and explanation of the King of Spain, who explained it this way. He says, they should enjoy liberty guaranteed through the action of having arrived in my dominions, and also that they were entitled to be given my clemency and royal protection and asylum. And of course, a lot of these decrees, including the Royal Cedula of 1789 and the British Cedula, or the British legislation in 1793, they also came with a lot of political connotations and backgrounds that often and sometimes did not fully benefit the individuals who were claiming freedom, but that offered opportunities for them to claim that freedom, at least at the many levels that these freedoms materialized, even when they may have been fragile. So I want that to be kept in mind. And so this cedula that was issued by the King of Spain applied to Mexican spaces, who at that point were under the governance of Spanish imperial law, just like Canada in 1793 was under the governance of British imperial law. So the decrees, while again they didn't offer complete or official abolition or full freedom, both offered the opportunity for people to claim freedom on their own terms in the very many levels that freedom, that they were able to craft that freedom in those spaces. And so one other thing that I wanted to highlight in this exhibit, and that it's going to be portrayed or presented, and I figured it is important to highlight, is that women such as, highlight, apart from women, the stories of women like Chloe and Teresa and their freedom fighting, is that that freedom fighting of women such as them prompted this legislation, or this gradual abolition of slavery processes that shaped North America writ large. So it shaped Canada, the US, and Mexico. They set in motion these processes that led to liberation, even if these processes came in very, slow and gradual motion. These gradual abolition laws led to people knowing and understanding that if they were enslaved in US spaces, they could leave and go north or go south of US slavery to claim their freedom. So these ideas, these two decrees that were issued in the 1780s and 1790s were being sent across these imperial spaces, at that time imperial under British and Spain, but they were being talked about. The decrees were being, for instance, for the 1789 decree, the authorities were disseminating this decree all across Mexican spaces. So not only the people that were carrying them to those spaces knew about these laws, the people that were enslaved in adjacent spaces, they also were knowing about this, as well as slaveholders in US spaces is starting to talk about this because of the fear of what these decrees would do to their enslaved property. So you keep that in mind. That's something that is going to be highlighted in this exhibit. And I would also, one of the things that I would do is that I'm planning to do for the exhibit is sort of offer lists, the graphs of the different decrees that were issued throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, both in Canadian spaces and in Mexican spaces. So another thing that I'm very excited to highlight is how the fight materialized, how this fight for freedom and liberation materialized north and south of US slavery. How did this processes were started, who was leading this? And this is where women, at least in the research that I have found, become very visible. You see them very active everywhere, north and south of US slavery. Women engineer liberation through their fight and through their flight. They were fighting to be free. They were procuring securities. They were procuring civil rights. They were procuring not only freedom, they were procuring the buying of land. They were procuring having intellectual conversations on what spaces would be optimal to settle and succeed. So they were looking for ways to help make freedom a reality. And I argue that all of these fights were happened through their liberation practices. This was part of these liberation practices that Black women were engineering. And so, for instance, I will talk about this particular document right here, which is a letter in the Liberator. In 1832, a Black woman wrote that piece, this one right here, for the abolitionist newspaper, the Liberator, where she voiced her support for Black Americans to move to Mexico because she believed that Mexico was a safe haven. In that letter, and I'm just going to summarize it because it's a lengthy one, she wrote, and I'm quoting her, "Where is that country to which we may remove and thus become free and equal, where the prospects for Black she says, sorry, I lost my spot here. Where is that country to which we may remove and thus become free and equal? I believe that country to be Mexico. Mexico, to her, was an independent nation, and I'm quoting her, independent nation, where the prospects for Black people were far better. Whereas in this country, the US, we are kept poor, and of course cannot aspire to anything more than what we always have been." This was a Philadelphia woman who was very involved in the abolitionist movement. She had done her research and placed much thought on the possibilities and futures that Black Americans could find in Mexico, particularly after carefully considered the non-white amalgamated populations of the country of Mexico. She conclusively argued that because Mexico had over 8 million colored people and a very rapid growth of amalgamation by 1832, this is when she was writing it, it was positioned as a nation where Black people could prosper and thrive. And these were her words, that Mexico had a very rapid growth of amalgamation. And so I see this same thing happening in the context of Canada. Black women were very active in writing about their intellectual ideas of where people could go to be free. We have very active women such as Marianne Shad Carey, who voiced very similar proposals at the same time that this other woman was proposing seeking Mexican spaces as safe havens. And so I put the introduction of the plea for immigration, or Notes of Canada West, that was written by Marianne Shad Carey, that really offered this her thoughts and ideas of why Canada was the place to go to. So you start seeing that Black women were thinking about both Mexico and Canada simultaneously as sites of freedom. And so another thing that I wanted to highlight in this exhibit that we're working on is to showcase the geographies of liberation that people crossed or traversed throughout this period between the 18th century and the 19th century. It has been very important to me to map the places that people moved across. For example, one of the women that I'm going to be highlighting or presenting in this exhibit is Lydia Adams and her fight for freedom. So to try to showcase her geography of liberation through her flight and mobility. Lydia was born enslaved in Fairfax, Virginia, so around this area. And she was born in the early to mid 1780s. The actual date is not shown in the records. And at first she was, she lived in this area, likely, up until her early teens. She does say that she was taken from that area to Wood County, Virginia, which later became part of West Virginia. So she lived in this area for 20 years. And there she lived and labored for 20 years. She had children there, and there all of her children were sold and sent away to the Deep South. So I'm going to also highlight this separation of families in these spaces, not only through the mobility of them moving to seek freedom, but people being moved and forced across the spaces by enslavers who were also moving to other spaces. And so Lydia talks about that in the last 3 years before she decided to run away, her son Daniel, Sarah, and Esther were also sold to the Deep South as well. And at some point after spending 20 years in West Virginia, in what became West Virginia, she was taken by her enslaver to Missouri. And there, she decided to escape, and she decided to claim freedom in Canada. And so in 1853, she left and headed north to Canadian destinations. She crossed the Detroit River and made it to Windsor, or to the Sandwich Township, Ontario, and there she claimed freedom. And I wanted to showcase her quote here because this is something that I want to also highlight in the exhibit, that that fight for freedom, that came from desires to deeply ingrained desires to be free, and that people were fighting to be free, even if they chose to not run away for whatever reason that may have been. But you see here that Lydia had been hoping to be free since she was a little child. They were fighting in very many ways, even if they decided to not flee. But in 1853, Lydia did did escape and made it to Sandwich. So I wanted to showcase this map, and mainly because, you know, I wanted to continue that geography where she decides to escape and make it to Upper Canada. And in the records show that she lived on the road that led from Windsor to the colony of the Refugee Home Society. She didn't quite settle in the colony of the Refugee Home Society, but she lived on that road that led to it in a log cabin that was situated there. And I added this smaller map because you see earlier maps of Canada West, or of where Windsor became. They had two main roads. This road right here, I don't know if you can see, yeah, my cursor. There was one main road that went northward and another one that went sort of like the Talbot Road that went southward. And so she lived on this road on the way from Windsor to the colony. And the colony was around this area, which I highlighted here for you. There were people that were living, a lot of the settlers of the Refugee Home Society lived along the Pucci River. This time and time again, I come across like this. They settle in this area along the banks of the river. And that is the Pucci River, and that is here. So she lived between Windsor and this area. And I haven't actually found exactly where her log cabin was. And as many of you may know, I was in Canada between 2019 and 2020 when the pandemic hit. And a lot of my research trips were cut short. And so there was a lot that was left unfinished with this research. So if anybody knows where Lydia Adams lived, please let me know. That would be much appreciated. But at least I hope this gives you a visual of what we're trying to portray in this exhibit. In addition to Lydia, I also want to highlight other women such as Phoebe. Phoebe was another freedom fighter who fled her enslaver and left U.S. slavery behind. But unlike Lydia, who fled north, Phoebe fled south towards Mexican destinations. Phoebe was 24-year-old woman born enslaved in North Carolina around 1796. Her original enslaver died, and she tells us that she was sold to another enslaver right after he died, who was extremely violent and who forced her to his plantation in Louisiana. She also tells us that when she was sold to this new enslaver, she actually was likely a little older. Perhaps it may have been in her 20s. She talks about her husband and how he actually died in the hands of that enslaver. And so, but she was removed to Louisiana. So I mark here that she was born in North Carolina, made it to Louisiana, where she labored, enslaved, and then she decided to flee and go to a Mexican space. Phoebe fled bondage in the spring of 1820, along with several companions. Together, they chose to journey across the Sabine River to the town of Nacogdoches. Then at that time, Nacogdoches was northern Mexico, or Mexico's northernmost presidio. And Phoebe actually made it all the way to Monterrey. So this is a map of of New Spain, and you start seeing where the boundaries of the U.S. were at that point. And so she made it all the way to this space. This is where Monterrey is. And in Monterrey, she was interviewed about her experience, and she described through an interpreter how she and her companions made the plan to escape bondage and why. She talks about how they had taken horses and provisions and had fled together as a measure of safety. She also explained that at one point during their journey to freedom, the group were chased by slave hunters, and some of them people that were with her were separated. And that one of them actually was attacked by the slave hunters, and he ended up dying upon arrival to Monterrey. And his name was Samuel. And so we know also about Samuel because of what Phoebe tells us. So when Phoebe was asked why she ran away from her enslaver, she clearly voiced that she understood that she would be treated better in the Mexican space than she had ever been treated by her violent enslaver. So I hope to showcase this in the exhibit as well, to give us, another geography where freedom was being claimed simultaneously, during the same period where people were claiming freedom in Upper Canada. So I hope that some of these maps do make that justice, or at least this history is justice. So beyond that, I do want to highlight, to showcase the realities that were going on in Canadian spaces, but also in Mexican spaces when it came to how freedom materialized in those spaces. What happened in those spaces? How did people live? And what type of freedom or freedoms were they able to secure? Well, for instance, as Marianne Charcari again, she explained very well that life in Canada was a struggle. And certainly her freedom or freedoms, the freedoms that Black people found in Canadian spaces were truly fragile, as you see in this letter. On November of 1851, for instance, she highlighted that the issues of discrimination and segregation in Canada, she spoke openly against the establishments of separatism, and how that was materializing in Canadian spaces. She went as far as openly criticized the Refugee Home Society for how it was developing as a colony that really was segregating Black people from the larger Canadian community. She once wrote actually that she was utterly opposed to what she called the spirit of caste, which in her regard, the spirit of caste was, she meant racial segregation, whether legally sanctioned by the Canadian government or the Canadian people or white Canadian people, or initiated by Black settlers themselves. She had an integrationist ideology and views, and was known to, directly critique segregation in Canada as early as the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s. I did want to showcase this in the exhibit to really highlight the realities of liberation in Canadian spaces as well. Freedom fighters had difficulty in many different respects, and even Carrie herself struggled when she was trying to establish a school for children that was not segregated. And she talks about that, and so I'm going to try to contextualize that as well through her writings and through her experience. And so this other letter that I have posted here is going to also help this exhibit offer some insight on how freedom fighters or people that arrived in Canadian spaces to claim freedom had difficulty obtaining lands in Canada. This is a letter by an abolitionist, Thomas Buxton, to the Lieutenant Governor of Canada. So with this, you start seeing that people were having, were struggling in very many different ways, even when freedom was a reality. But yet, what was the reality of freedom on the ground once they arrived? This will help showcase how that happened. And simultaneously, I also wanted to do the same thing for Mexican spaces so that we can see both Canadian destinations and Mexican destinations in tandem, which I argue is something very important to do in order to fully understand these narratives that not only shape liberation in North America, but really connect the way that liberation offers this thread that links Mexico, the U.S., and Canada together, and that has linked it through and through the experiences of Black Americans who left the U.S. to claim freedom outside of the U.S. And so I have found a lot of similarities with what was going on in terms of the realities experienced by people who left the U.S. to go to Mexico. For instance, I've spoken about this before. Black abolitionists were very active, and as we showcased the letter of this Black woman right here, who wrote about Mexico and how Mexico could be a safe haven where people could go to. Black abolitionists were doing this work as well. They were writing to the Mexican president, asking for, ways to move, what securities the Mexican government was willing to offer, and that is showcased in this letter. And Mexico was responding, and they were saying, if you guys want to come to Mexico, we will offer land for cultivation, plots for houses where you can establish towns, and tools for work under the obligation that you obey the law of the country. And so what you see on the screen is actually one of the initial letters sent to the president of Mexico by Samuel Webb, a Black abolitionist, asking, what things, what rights and opportunities would Mexico offer Black Americans if we choose to leave and go south. And so we had those realities, just like in Canadian Spaces, they had these realities of freedom, tangible, civil rights, they could live. But then we also had the realities of like the struggles to actually get what both Canadian and Mexican authorities were claiming to offer. So it were, these individuals who were arriving, which I situate as freedom fighters, they were making Mexico and Canada accountable through their fighting, through their practices. They were saying, okay, we're here, how are you going to help us? But I also wanted to showcase in this exhibit the struggles. For instance, for Mexico, while these realities were, in many ways, positive, they were in many ways negative. People, for instance, this record shows that the community, a Mexican community in near Matamoros, there were, people were arriving from the U.S. and trying to find work as this man named Joseph, or he took the name of Jose in Mexico. And Jose was a carpenter, but he was having a really hard time finding work once he arrived and claimed freedom in Mexico. And some of this, you start seeing the racialized, segregationist ideas and racism in Mexican spaces as well. Because the Mexican community started complaining about Joseph, who took the name of Jose, saying, "Hey, he's a vagrant, he's a vago, and he has no job. He's just vagrant. He's just running around, not doing anything." And so he was committed to jail based on those reports and accusations by the local Mexican community because he was a vagrant. And you start seeing that a lot of these things were happening that was really actively limiting the freedom that Mexico was offering through instances like this, where people who were looking for work that had recently arrived, were struggling on how to access those rights that Mexico had so claimed to offer. So I wanted to talk about this in context with the realities in Canada in this exhibit, because I think it will allow us to see the good and the bad of Canadian and Mexican spaces of freedom, and how the freedoms that people were able to claim and secure were vastly different, but also were similar across North America. And so I'm not going to go into detail on this, but this exhibit will also highlight the process of citizenship in places like Canada and Mexico. For instance, in Canada, I found out, and this is something that I didn't know before, for instance, subjecthood or naturalization in Canada materialize in very diverse ways. And the exhibit will list these ways and present them in a way that is that makes this history visible and better understood. For those of you that are from Canada, you may already know this, but people that are not from Canada, like myself, I did not know this, and I was actually surprised to learn about this process. Prior to the Canadian Citizenship Act of 1947, there was no such thing as Canadian citizenship. So that would be attained, like Canadian citizenship was not on the table, but it was what could be attained was British subjecthood or naturalization certificates in Canada. So how these processes happened were like a lot of these started happening in 1844, but really a lot of these laws and decrees applied mostly to white British subjects that were moving across the British Empire, into Upper Canada, for instance. It applied only to them. It wasn't until 1859 that the law stated that anyone who came to any part of Canada with the intent to settle and had resided there for the continuous period of 3 years may be issued British subjecthood and naturalization. So this, of course, was contingent upon approval of the local authorities. They had to go through this process. They had to go through this hearing, and if nobody complained or prevented that from happening, then they would be issued those requests will be filed, and British certificate of naturalization would be issued. But I also wanted to highlight something that I found important to highlight in our exhibit, that it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't until 1859 that this was a possibility for Black Americans in Canada, even though there were, once they reached Canada, they had civil rights. They could purchase land. They could have all these rights and opportunities, except for naturalization until 1859. But yet, I wanted to showcase this letter right here from April 5th, 1841, because it further showcases that up until 1841, there were conversations going on that were being discussed in Canada regarding whether to offer this British subjecthood or naturalization pathways for Black Americans arriving in Canadian spaces. This document shows that on April 5th, 1841, Black people arriving in Canada could not be naturalized or become British subjects for that matter. This letter truly shows us that this is actually a letter about Black Americans who are arriving in places like Toronto. And this was written by Mr. E. de Saint-Remy, a British official who suggested, he was proposing ways to address this discrimination and ostracization that was being experienced by Black Americans in Canada. And I'm not going to read it all, but this proposal was to propose that Black people do get naturalization, at least comprehensive, as soon as possible. And this was 1841, which allows us to see that up until 1841, Black Americans arriving in Canada could not claim naturalization, at least until 1841. And then the process gets a bit confusing, but we're going to try to contextualize this as listed in the exhibit, mainly because it's important to understand it in the context of the US and in the context of Mexico, where Mexico was claiming as early as the 1820s that people could become citizens as soon as they set foot on Mexican soil. All they had to do is go through the process. They could join the military, and people were doing that, joining the military, fighting for Mexico, and becoming and petitioning for citizenship. Sometimes citizenship came in the cultural sense, and it wasn't until 1857 where Mexico actually added it to the Constitution, where it said, which was interestingly the same year of the Dred Scott case, where the U.S. denied citizenship for Black Americans, that Mexico added to the Constitution that Black Americans, as soon as they set foot on Mexican soil, were free and could be citizens. And so, but there's also other instances and exceptions where in 1850s, the mid 1850s, a few years before, people were actually claiming citizenship in Mexico. So I found that it's very important to situate these two processes together to allow us to better understand these hidden histories, or at least that I argue were hidden histories. And so to conclude, I really wanted to talk about three women that embodied these processes and this period that I'm trying to highlight in this exhibit, where women were leading a lot of these processes and pushing forward a lot of these resistance. And two women that I wanted to talk about before I conclude is Lisette Denison and Sylvia Routh. And this exhibit really wanted to highlight them because both were women who no longer escape enslavement, but really work towards crafting freedom in the north and south of U.S. slavery. For instance, Elizabeth Denison was born in Detroit. She was born in slavery. She won her freedom by escaping with one of her brothers to Canada after a court ruling by the Michigan Territory, after a court ruling by the Michigan Territory Supreme Court in 1807, which stated that anyone who escaped and who established their freedom in Canada could not be returned to slavery upon return to the U.S. And so Elizabeth returned to Detroit a free woman in 1825, and she purchased 48 acres of land in Pontiac, making her the first Black woman to own land in the U.S. So you start seeing women like Denison opening up spaces and avenues for women and men and children to claim freedom, to claim better futures. And Elizabeth also, interestingly enough, invested money in the first steamboat built in the Upper Lakes. And so she also became one of the first Black women, if not the first Black woman, to own boats and to be in the shipping business and across the Detroit River borderlands as well. And I am exploring Elizabeth Denison in this exhibit mainly because with all of her efforts and her fight for betterment and her freedom and owning business and owning land, I I'm exploring the possibility of her role in helping people to freedom in Canadian spaces. Because if she owned a boat, um, it is my argument, or at least my hope, that she was in the business of the Underground Railroad. And again, as I said, a lot of my research in Canadian spaces was cut short. And so I'm hoping to really delve more into her, at least open up that space to have conversations on what her role may have been. And if you do know more about her and want to share that with me, that would be wonderful. If you want to collaborate, that would be amazing. And I wanted to situate her alongside Sylvia Ralph because Sylvia was a woman who arrived enslaved to Mexican Texas in 1827, and she fought for her freedom for many years, finally securing that freedom in 1837. And throughout the 1840s and 1850s, Sylvia bought land. She became the first Black woman to own land in what became Houston, Texas. And she assisted people to freedom in Mexico on the boats that she owned. So she also became one of the first, if not the only, Black woman to own a shipping business in the Texas-Mexico borderlands. And so she will be highlighted as well. And her role in claiming freedom, but opening up spaces for people to find freedom and betterment in this borderland, and how she helped people to freedom. So I really wanted to situate both women in the same context and in the same exhibit to give this depth to these histories led by women, and really to the processes engineered by women in the context of liberation. And so I wanted to conclude this presentation with the story of another woman, another freedom fighter when I started reading about Matilda and learning about her, she immediately made me think about Chloe Cooley and her fight. And this is, I think, brings this story full circle and will bring this story of the exhibit that I'm trying to thread through the exhibit full circle. Matilda was born enslaved in Louisiana in the late 1840s, but she left her enslavement to claim her freedom in Mexico. She fled and took with her her baby daughter, Harriet. Matilda and Harriet arrived in Mexico, at some point in the late 1840s. And by August of 1850, they were living there free. They had Matilda had a job. She was living in a house and working for a Mexican rancher or family, a ranching family in Mexico, Los del Fierro. And she worked there. She was living free. And yet, in August of 1850, that by August she was already living free. One night in August, her former enslaver, who had been looking for her, found out where she was, and he illegally crossed the Mexican border, went to where she was living at the ranch of the Mexican family, found the house where she was sleeping in, and tried to force her out of there and take her back, kidnap her and take her back to U.S. slavery. And like Chloe Cooley, Matilda fought with all she had. She started hitting him with her hands. She started screaming and yelling for help, much like Chloe Cooley. She was truly fighting to continue to secure that freedom. And it worked. People started coming to her help. Her employer heard that she was screaming. A lot of the Mexican community heard it. They came to her help. The employer, Manuel Luis del Fierro, came with a gun and stopped the slave holder from taking her back. At this same time, her daughter had been taken by one of the slave hunters accompanying the former enslaver. And he was on horseback, so he took the daughter, but the community in the next town stopped him and brought Harriet back to Matilda. And so Matilda never went back to U.S. slavery. Instead, the former enslaver was taken to jail. And that is why we know about Matilda's story. You see here, this is part of the core documents that are left in this was from the Archivo General de Matamoros. And I found part of her story in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and I found more of her story in Mexico City, in La Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. So I was able to put together the story about her based on her testimony and her witness account, because she was interviewed about what had happened, and she tells us how she fought to remain free in Mexico. And here, I just wanted to put this here because in this slave schedule, I was able to find out what Harriet's, because I didn't know, based on these two records, I didn't know what Harriet's name was until I found this, where it's a list where her enslaver claims that, he owned them, but you see here, fugitive, that both of them were runaways, so they had left. And so they were runaways because they were free in Mexico. And so with that, I conclude, and I thank you so much for being here today with me and listening to this super long conversation. But I look forward to all of your questions and discussions. And I look forward to, producing this exhibit and for you all to see it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was fantastic. So if anyone has any questions, if you want to raise your hand or if you want to type something in the comment section, I can read that for you.
Can you all see me now, or?
Yes, we could see you throughout. So we could see you. Yeah. We did have one comment while you were presenting about in Michigan. Stating that I think it was when you were talking about Denison. It says the first Black woman to purchase land in Michigan. There were other Black women who received land in Detroit through the 1805 land lottery after the fire. So just wanted to read that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Yes. I'll ask a question. So I've read in local newspapers here in Windsor, Essex, how the reunion between families. I was wondering if the press discussed that in terms of Mexico, if there was a lot of families that were separated and then found each other once they arrived. Was it more common for a woman to escape independently or with groups or with her children? If you could answer those, that would be great.
Thank you. That is a wonderful question. What I have seen in the context of the U.S.-Mexico border spaces or women that were leaving and going to Mexican spaces is that women were living with children, as you see Matilda, or, they were living with their children. Sometimes they were caught and taken back, or then sometimes when they did reach Mexican spaces, they would keep fighting to bring their families back. And you see this through and through, not only with the experiences of women, but also the experiences of men that I have found in Mexico. People were arriving and then finding ways to have the Mexican government help them, or force the Mexican government to help them to bring the rest of their family to freedom. Great.
Did anyone have any questions for Maria? maybe while people are thinking of questions, you can maybe comment about, I mean, you've been talking about what the exhibit will include. You've given us a small piece of what you'll be talking about, but how many women do you plan on featuring in the exhibit?
So I think I had accorded with you all to limit it to about perhaps 6 to 8 women, just to keep it brief and better contextualize their experiences and the geographies across which they traversed. And so it is not going to be, as I mentioned, a comprehensive exhibit that covers it all, but I wanted to present mainly undertold narratives of women who I didn't grow up learning about, and perhaps people in the audience or in Canadian spaces didn't grow up learning about them. I think one of the most famous ones that I situate here, or some of them are, Chloe Cooley and Denison, and they are largely known, but they're also very unknown to people in Mexico or to other people in the U.S. So I hope that this exhibit offers a platform for people that may have grown up not learning about certain stories to learn about them, because they're going to be situated in the same context, in this continental, transnational, or I should say extranational context together. At least that is my hope.
Great. I just had one other question, talking about female narratives, and in terms of where did you most find the female narratives, in the press, in I guess diaries or journals, or where are you finding the narratives of these women?
So for for women that reach Canadian spaces, I utilize primary accounts such as William Still, Benjamin Drew, newspaper articles, The Liberator, so Black abolitionist newspapers and conversations and correspondence. For Mexican sources, I found a lot scattered across different Mexican archives. For those I really had to dig, it is. I hope that this exhibit also highlights the hardships of the archives. A lot of the narratives for for people that reach freedom in Canada are better known. They're better documented, I should say. Their archives are better known, the archival threads. But for Mexico, it was really a matter of, I've spent several years mining Mexican archives, because the records are there, but they haven't been cataloged, they haven't been talked about. They're not as well known as those in Canada or Canadian archives. They're been harder to access. And so the way I found, I like to say that is by pure luck. I think that in recent years, the scholarship has interest in these records have heightened. So a lot of researchers are in Mexico or have been in Mexico looking for similar. And so if when I've gone in there, sometimes I say, hey, I'm looking for this, and they say we don't have anything. But then sometimes by pure luck, I find something, and I said, oh, you said you didn't have anything, but here's this. And they're like, oh yeah, well, and this actually happens, like, oh yeah, you're looking for that. Oh, I have another scholar was researching this, and she found this too, so I'll give it to you. So accessibility in Mexican archives is also hard. It just depends who's there, how well you get to know the archivist, if they like you or not. So it's been more of a struggle in Mexican archives because of that. But most of the narratives for the women that I'm going to present in this exhibit that arrived in Mexico come from just the Archivo General de la Nación, which is the main archive in Mexico City, and from the archive collections of places like Matamoros or Monterrey, so and Veracruz. So they're not necessarily compiled as we have like William Steele's narratives or Benjamin Drew's or Marianne Charcari. So.
Great, thank you so much. Kimberly Simmons, she has a question or a comment. She says, "Good afternoon, Dr. Hammack. I am so proud to see your research has come to life since I last saw it. When is the exhibit to be installed? Dr. Roche is another colleague of mine and believe you two have great people tied to this research along with Everett Fly."
Thank you, Professor Simmons. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm just so very grateful that that I'm still in your radar and that you've kept up with this. I do think that I've been very fortunate to have conversations with professors such as yourself, but also professors in the U.S. such as Cheryl LaRoche, and just the amount of knowledge and ideas have been phenomenal. And for this particular exhibit, it has been long in the making, and I hope that this had been done earlier, but I think this is the perfect time. What we hope to do is to have it ready at some point mid-March for Women's History Month. It might be mid to late March. And so, but we're working hard to make it happen in brick and mortar, and as well as have a virtual component to it, to get people exposed to a better understanding that freedom and liberation really was a matter of the North American Black experience, and not necessarily individual to Canada or US and Mexico. I think these histories really do connect. And I hope the exhibit shows that, or at least highlights that. History is intertwined. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So if there's no more questions, we will end it there. For anyone who is looking in the chat, an article was also provided about female landowners, property owners in the chat if you wanted to take a look at that as well. But thank you so much, Dr. Hammack. I thoroughly enjoyed what you had to say, and I'm so excited for us to put together your exhibit and have it on display in the museum. So everyone can just stay tuned to our social media pages for more information. So thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Hammack. That was fantastic.
Thank you. And I have to say, thank you so much for these tips that you're sending me. And caveat that I have to add is that I was not able to finish all that I had planned to finish while I was in Canada. So I'm very thankful for any sources, readings that you want to send my way. But I am hoping to make it back to Canada soon to continue that research and really get the full experience of the Canadian experience. Thank you so much.
We are looking forward to when you get back here. So thank you again so much, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.